Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Thomas Vecchione.
Well, it's great to be here talking about a subject that I love, which is the future of workplace. And just a few short words before we have our terrific panel today. But industry sectors fuel cities, and no better way do we see that happening in New York today with the huge migration of technology companies, media and creative, the acceleration of innovation. So really, New York is in a huge state of transformation. And the business platform behind this new economy is space. And how do corporate offices and office space and innovation space become a platform for this new entrepreneurial mindset that we see happening? There are 69 million workers, blue-collar workers in the United States, and we want to attract as many of them as we can. There are 82 million millennials coming into the workforce by 2030, and we want to make sure we build platforms for them to be in New York. So the issues are really relevant and pressing. And today's conversation is about how do we understand complex and challenging real estate portfolios to adapt to this new model of business? And how do entrepreneurs engage in understanding those portfolios to really build the new economy in New York? And some of the questions we might want to address in this panel are ideas about accommodating a spectrum of companies within the real estate community, everything from a Fortune 500 to a startup. How do we understand office design and how to understand building design as they change to adapt to this more complex and diverse kind of portfolio? What are the most driving preferences with the next generation of economy and millennials and how they live, work, and play in the same environments? And what does the cultural legacy of our former business districts and how do we adapt and reinvent those moving towards the future? So I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dan Geiger, senior reporter from Crain's, and I know that we'll have a terrific conversation today. Thank you.
Well, we better launch right into it because we've got a lot of ground to cover in the next, I think, 31 minutes and 30 seconds. I wanted to start this off, I think, with, obviously just getting right into the news, which I think is so really exemplifies what this panel is all about and what we're going to be talking about today. JP Morgan Chase, as probably you all have read, is considering a deal to go to the Hudson Yards. That was really what the Hudson Yards was created for, right? To accommodate big corporate tenants like this. And their huge space needs, and yet they're saying they need $1 billion of tax breaks to make that deal make sense. What does that say about the kind of climate we have in the city in creating the kind of space that's affordable for these tenants? If they're saying we need $1 billion of breaks to be able to afford this space, what does that say? Are we accommodating them? I wanted to throw that out to you, Kyle, to get started with. That was the easiest question.
I have read that. So I think, look, Hudson Yards is a generation-type project, creating so much commercial space. There's already a deep level of benefit when in that conversation. So part of that $1 billion conversation, there is a deep pool of as-of-right benefits that come along with the Hudson Yards development project. So it's really a question of what incremental a company might need. Obviously, I can't comment on a conversation that's ongoing with JP Morgan, but the mayor has been very clear that the proposal that's been on the table is not something we would entertain because it's just over and above what we would normally consider. But at the same time, we are committed to making it easier for a company like JP Morgan to make such a critical investment. Mm-hmm. It's a critical company to our city's economy and a number of workers here who really make this city what it is. And so it's certainly important for us to have a constructive conversation with JP Morgan about potential big investment in Hudson Yards. But at the same time, we have an obligation to the program that was set forth that does provide a deep level of benefit.
But I guess I wanted to just throw out there, maybe Seth, maybe you can tackle this too. What does this say about the affordability of office space in Manhattan for these major corporate users, which need a lot of space? Can they afford to be here?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I'm glad that Kyle had to field that question. But look, I think there are a couple of things. One is that what a company asks for and what a company needs are two different things. And I don't know enough about the JP Morgan project to know if there's a gap between what's requested and what's needed. But I think at the end of the day, what it's reflective of is a fact that we all have to deal with here in New York City, which, by the way, is a symptom of the success of our city, which is that the demand is so great for space, whether it's commercial, residential, industrial, retail. The demand is so great for space that the costs are going up. And if we want to be successful as a city, we have to think about how we can keep the city affordable. And there's a lot of discussion going on today, I think appropriately, thanks to the mayor and the administration, about making sure that we have affordable housing to allow people to live in. I think that's a critical issue for us to deal with. But I think that we also have to make sure that we're not losing sight of the need for affordable commercial space as well. And you are using the J.P. Morgan transaction as the example of this. In some ways, I actually think that that's the wrong example to point to, because this is a very large, very successful company. The place where it really has an impact on us as a city is for smaller companies, startup businesses, businesses in more marginal industries. How do we make sure that we have sufficient space for those kinds of businesses to allow them to grow and expand here?
Andrew, what do you think about that? Is there enough opportunity for these small?
As usual, Seth is right on point. I mean, I would say the same thing. I think you have a number of forces happening that are really exciting in the city, and they've been building over the last 10, 15 years. Young people want to be in urban areas again. They want to make things. There's now technology that allows them to make things in really small spaces. You can manufacture in 500 square feet when you used to need 10,000 square feet. You can prototype in a matter of hours or days when it used to take you 6 to 12 months. And that's what we've seen over and over again in the last 8 years of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and now that I'm seeing down at Industry City. And increasingly, Brooklyn and Queens are becoming the destination of choice for these, I like to call, innovation economy companies, the broad range of making a physical, a digital, or an engineered product. So already I see Brooklyn and Queens as the destination of choice for these small buildings, for these small businesses. On top of that, though, Seth is absolutely right, those who start in New York City, particularly a place like Midtown South, make it cool. All of a sudden, the hedge fund guys want to move into Midtown South because they want to be in the cool. And then where do those small businesses go? They need to find affordable commercial space. And those are the kinds of opportunities that a lot of us are working on now out in Brooklyn.
It's like gentrification, but in the office market of sorts.
I hate that word. I would say it's about good paying job creation in sectors that matter for the future of New York City. And I want to emphasize that, because what's amazing about these sectors of growth, if you put a circle around the job codes for engineering, for manufacturing, for research and development, and all of the subsectors that feed into that, food, fashion, light manufacturing, those are the growth sectors in New York City. Far faster than financial services. So J.P. Morgan may be getting the headlines today, but the real job growth is in those other sectors, and they tend to create jobs that pay more, 30 to 50% more than the service sector, move people up the economic ladder. And the mayor has been brilliant at focusing on this income inequality, and I think that these are the sectors that address that. So gentrification tends to imply people getting pushed out. I would say what's happening is these sectors allow people to come in and move up the economic ladder.
And I think it's also about repurposing assets that we have. I mean, this is exactly what Andrew's doing in the Navy Yard, and a lot of other landlords are doing across the Brooklyn waterfront. That's an emerging, Brooklyn-Queens waterfront that's emerging innovation corridors, is repurposing what's there to adapt to the sort of the changing nature of the workplace for some strata of companies, all the way from the Brooklyn Army Terminal in the south through Industry City, up through the Brooklyn-Queens waterfront. It's really about using the existing stock we have to meet the needs of a certain strata of the commercial business community.
Dan, I wanted to shift it to you. You're handling the leasing at Dumbo Heights. That's a huge office complex in Dumbo. Can you see a day when you think that hedge funds will want to take space there and operate there, and it'll go way beyond some of the traditional midtown tenants will actually want to come there, not just the creative firms, but you could actually see it as a place for everybody?
Absolutely.
Mainstream appeal.
Sure. I mean, there's no greater example of repurposing buildings than what we're doing at Dumbo Heights. 5 former printing buildings, industrial buildings, that are converted to a 1.2 million square foot, over 5 building complex, a premier tech campus. I think a lot has to do with the way that the buildings are prepared and designed. It's allowing that flexibility that it doesn't just have to be one sector. Although we are catering to the tech community, a lot of these firms are also, have arms of their firms that are trying to attract the same talent as the tech community. So it's a lot of designing the spaces with flexibility in mind, so that it doesn't just have to be an advertising or media company. It can be other sectors as well. But that being said, we are very much catering to a tech community. That's a lot what Dumbo is, and that's a lot of what Brooklyn is. That's a lot of where the major talent or the engineering talent and the creative talent actually lives.
Yeah, just wanted to add to that
Yes, Rob.
we just announced this morning a joint venture with Kushner Companies and LiveWork for the acquisition of a site in the Gowanus. And I think part of the
I just want to put that into context for a second, Rob. This is SL Green. This is the biggest commercial landlord in all of the city. They own all the best assets, or some of the best assets, right in the heart of Midtown. Some. RXR's got a few good ones, too. And today it was announced, as you mentioned, you're buying a stake in a building in of all places, Gowanus.
Well, it's actually land.
Okay, it's land.
Across from the
Okay.
Whole Foods, yeah. But the point that I was going to make is that the key to, I think, delivering affordable office space is buying land at a basis that allows you to build effectively. And that's
what do you have planned? Talk about
That's going to push people out into Brooklyn and into Long Island City to develop new office space that can be affordable.
So you guys are going to obviously develop an office project there?
That's yet to be seen. The council member, Brad Lander, is going through a study of what the future of Gowanus might be, along with the community, and we're following that obviously very closely. We can develop this site in an as-of-right manner.
Right.
So we'd love to see the area rezoned. We think that the potential is there for it to be rezoned.
Right. Kyle, I wanted to shift back to you. I had a conversation with Kathy Wild from the Partnership from NYC recently, and she talked about that in the past it was the back office jobs that we had to worry about in the city, that the big employers were taking their, I guess clerks and people who were filing stuff away and putting them in cheaper office districts. They didn't need to be in the middle of Manhattan. Now it's shifting. Those jobs are already out of Manhattan. Now it's just the middle management, and it's engulfing a whole new tier of employment. Do you see a vast chunk of employees in Manhattan as being, their days are numbered here essentially, that they're going to be shifted? It's just a matter of time before they're shifted to cheaper office markets?
I think you'll see a couple of things. One, I think you'll see the market is certainly responding for the need for office space here in the city with Hudson Yards, with East Midtown, and the incredible growth you're seeing in Midtown South. So I think you'll continue to see companies, certainly headquarters and some of their executives here in Manhattan. I think, as sort of Andrew said, I think what you're seeing in the Brooklyn, Queens waterfront specifically, and even in the South Bronx to some extent, is you are seeing more of a creative class moving into those neighborhoods. We are no longer thinking about the outer boroughs as a place where companies will have a headquarters in Manhattan and they'll have their back office in Long Island City or downtown Brooklyn. We are now actively positioning those neighborhoods for company headquarters. So I think you will see over time company headquarters located in central business districts outside of Manhattan, such as downtown Brooklyn, Long Island City, and maybe even in the...
Go ahead, Seth.
In some ways, sometimes the conversation about the future of the city when you're talking about cost reminds me of the Yogi Berra quote, which I'm sure I'm going to get wrong, that it's so crowded nobody goes there anymore.
Right.
And I mean, the Manhattan is expensive not because people can't afford it. Manhattan is expensive because people are paying those rents. And the phenomena that we're seeing are a result not of companies moving out of the city. There are certainly examples of that, but it's the phenomenon that we're seeing is an example of businesses moving operations into the city, moving people, taking space. Our vacancy rates are going down as our rents are going up, not the opposite. And so I think that there will always be a demand, I believe, for prime Manhattan space. And in many ways, that demand and the fact that we're not creating enough new supply in those locations is what's part of the phenomenon that's driving then people out of those core markets and to look at places like in the past Midtown South or the Far West Side, increasingly places like Lower Manhattan or even in the outer boroughs. I think it's a combination of that push as well as then a pull that's coming from those neighborhoods because increasingly people want to work in and live in neighborhoods that have a certain character to them, that are walkable, that are diverse, that are accessible to public transit. And that really, if you kind of go through the checklist, that describes many of the outer borough neighborhoods. So I don't think that this phenomenon is in any way a symptom of problems in Manhattan. It's a symptom of the success of Manhattan again, and we as a city should be building on that, and we should be encouraging the creation of new inventory in the outer borough markets so that we can meet the demand that's going to increasingly be going there. The one thing, though, that I would add, though, is that I won't use the word gentrification because I agree with Andrew, it's not a great word, but one thing that is happening in many of these places is we're repurposing buildings from older uses to newer uses. We are driving up the cost for more marginal businesses, and among the more marginal sectors in the city are the industrial sector. And I do think there is a real danger that as we're seeing more housing development, more commercial office development in some of these outer borough neighborhoods that were traditionally centers of industry, that those businesses are either going to be forced out of business or forced to leave the city. And I think that's bad for the city because a lot of them provide services that are necessary for the functioning of the city. But it's also bad if we want to try to address issues like income inequality, because they tend to be the kinds of industries that employ people who don't have a lot of formal education at decent wages.
Is there a home for those types of businesses at Industry City, Andrew? The 6 million square foot complex that your firm, Jamestown, is currently repositioning.
Yeah,
in Sunset Park.
We got a lot of space, and we inherited a space last year when we took over that was 30% vacant, 40% underutilized, meaning storage with very few jobs. And that's because for many, many years along the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront, as large-scale manufacturing went away, private owners really didn't know what to do. And the easy thing was fill it up with some storage, take your $5-6 a square foot, and don't put a dime into the buildings. And in our case, that led to $250–300 million of deferred maintenance. The reason that the group of investors that I work for got involved was that they saw what was happening, not just at the Navy Yard, because that's great, and what was happening at BAT, because that's great, both subsidized somewhat by government, but that the private sector was starting to get it. That 2 young guys were buying the Pfizer building and filling it up with food manufacturers, that 1,000 Dean Street was coming out of the ground, that folks were looking at Dumbo Heights and the Watchtower buildings as a place to create a creative hub. I think what's unique about our site is the scale. It's the largest privately owned industrial site in the city, and so I think it's a real experiment in how can you get the private sector in a big way involved in supporting the broad range of innovation economy uses, including what I think Seth would call older scale industrial uses. And I think what's interesting about the community that we're creating, and it's going to a sense of place and office, is these businesses want to be around each other. We don't want a place just filled up with tech firms. We don't want a place just filled up with large-scale manufacturing, because you're never going to do that. We want a place that's a mix of all of that. The artist wants to be next to the fashion designer, that wants to be next to the woodworker, that wants to be next to the tech startup, that wants to be next to the filmmaker. And that's the kind of community we want to build. So many of these industries feed off of each other. So I think there is a place for that wide range of businesses at Industry City.
Can I just add to the
Dan, go
previous
ahead.
question before in terms of people getting pushed out of Manhattan or finding alternative space? I think the real draw for Dumbo Heights also is that it's not just people getting pushed out of Manhattan. It's a lifestyle choice. They actually want to be in Brooklyn. We have a lot of firms that are even looking at us from the West Coast that it reminds them of Silicon Valley. They want to be in that type of neighborhood. They want to be around other like-minded companies. They want to be around the Etsy and the WeWorks of the world. So it's bringing to market some much needed creative space that people want to be in, not because they're being forced to, but because they want to be around stuff like that. And also they want to cater to their workforce as well. Many of them live in Brooklyn. It's not an inconvenience for them to come to Brooklyn. It's actually rewarding them.
One thing we have to figure out just to merge these two conversations is we have to, and this is a great audience to sort of leave with this homework, is we have to figure out as a city, because the industrial sector exists on a particularly horizontal plane, and we are increasingly a vertical city.
Yeah.
We have to figure out how these industrial and commercial and residential can coexist, separate and apart from the hardcore industrial uses. We have to figure out a way through building typology, through modernization of zoning, through just a modernization of how we think about the coexistence of those three sectors. We have to have a building typology where the three can coexist, and that you have residential uses at the top, potentially light manufacturing in the middle, and medium manufacturing at the bottom. So we have to figure that out, I think, as a city, because these three uses have to coexist in a vertical plane, not a horizontal.
Is there a plan, Kyle? I just want to ask, and Rob, I'll get to you in a second, to incorporate that and have that fusion of uses?
Sure, we're actively working on ways to, through a building typology, figuring out a way for a building to work and how to stack it correctly to get that, to sort of demonstrate that concept. Because we will fill the space at BAT, Andrew will fill the space, you will fill the space in Dumbo Heights, but we still have to figure out how manufacturing, residential, and commercial can coexist.
Yeah, I think the key issue there is the tension between the R zone and the M zone in the zoning itself, and that M zones limit potential uses for the site, but those M zones were originally created to house industrials that created environmental issues. But as we've gone to cleaner manufacturing technologies, the stigma around the M zone really no longer exists. So the administration should focus on that tension and see if we can rework the concept of manufacturing zoning into light manufacturing zoning, coupling it with office and residential use.
Now, Seth, I know you've been skeptical of that, and I wanted to get that. You said that, I know we've talked about this very thing in the past, where you've said, well, once you create the mix of, you bring the residential in, neighbors are going to complain about the hammering of that furniture maker in the bottom floor, and eventually those tenants it'll just go pure residential eventually.
Yeah, I think there's certainly that problem, and I think there are very few, if any, examples of where mixed-use zoning has really resulted over the long term in mixed use. There have been points in time where it's reached that equilibrium, but it usually ends up tipping. But in addition to that, there's also a valuation issue, which is that if you can build what you want, then you're always going to end up going towards the highest value uses.
The residential.
Yeah,
right.
and you'll end up through land values, through building values, pricing those other uses out of the area. And it's not to say that you should just throw up your hands and say that it's not the right intention. I think it absolutely is the right thing to try to figure out how to do, because we're a city where one of the limiting factors is land. And so we have to figure out how to pile things on top of each other. My only point is it hasn't worked with what we've done in the past, and so we need to try new models. And I think we need to engage in the exercise rigorously and skeptically to make sure that we do it right.
Kyle, I just want to give you a chance to answer that. Is that something that
no,
you
it's
think?
certainly, I grew up under Seth, so I definitely have trained that way, to think that way. I do think, though, that if it's just a conversation about preservation, industrial won't survive that conversation. Because the math just doesn't favor preservation, and I can't throw enough subsidies at projects over the long term to move the math specifically away from residential.
Although, can I just make one point on that, just to be a little controversial? But I mean, the market tells us that industrial doesn't belong in New York City. The market also tells us that affordable housing doesn't belong in New York City. But we, as a city, have made the decision that we're going to devote significant amounts of resources to subsidize affordable housing because it's a social good that we think is important. I think that the industrial sector similarly provides a social good to the city by providing these kinds of jobs to a class of people that otherwise has a very hard time finding jobs at living wages. And we might want to think about using our subsidy regimes in order to try to help that sector, just like we do with the affordable housing sector.
And there's another way we can do that, though, through densification. I know that Alicia Glenn and the mayor are highly focused on that. Through densification and prescriptive zoning, we can allow for this mix of uses without direct subsidy.
I think there are lots of shades of gray here, and it's a very complicated topic, and I know the administration is looking really closely at, trying to work with a zoning regimen that dates back to the 1960s and really needs to be updated and looked at, particularly around industrial zones. Look, I agree with Seth that you have to have some areas, and I would argue predominantly those should be the city-owned areas that really focus on the heavier industrial. But I would argue that as Kyle was, that we're never going to fully embrace those sectors that make sense for the long term in New York without looking at this from a positive viewpoint instead of a negative viewpoint. The negative viewpoint is we have to retain, we have to retain, we have to retain. The positive viewpoint is what's working, let's build it. And I would argue there's a broad range of makers in a number of sectors that might not meet those traditional 1950s, 1960s NAICS codes of manufacturing, right? Film is not in manufacturing NAICS codes, but I think everybody in the room would agree that when you're making a film and you're building a set, you're manufacturing something. And that's one of the things I think we really changed perceptually at the Navy Yard over the last 10 years. And so I would like to see more focus on growing the innovation economy, because they also, those sectors, that broader look at manufacturing, they're also creating those good paying jobs.
How do you do that, Andrew? Just more grants to these different startups?
No, it doesn't. That's the great news, is it doesn't need to be subsidized. They are growing themselves. They're the fastest growing sectors in New York City, if you draw a circle around all those creative industries. And we need to help them grow. And I think we can do that by focusing on supporting projects in the outer boroughs that are going to create affordable commercial industrial space.
And a good example of this modernization of the zoning piece is, if you think about it, a software manufacturer, someone who's coding, someone who's creating software, is a manufacturer. And a lot of that's happening in Midtown South, but we don't think of Midtown South necessarily outside of the garment district as a manufacturing sector. But in the spirit of manufacturing, where you take raw goods and turn it into something that's greater than the sum of its parts, like software, again, just in terms of thought-provoking, that is manufacturing, and we just have to modernize how we think about in this city what manufacturing is, how we account for it in the zoning, how we subsidize it if we do it all, and then how our building typology meets the needs.
And I will say, maybe I think Seth is probably right. We haven't seen examples where live work with innovation economy in the same stack as residential works. I'm not sure we've tried it, but I don't know that there are a lot of great examples. But we do have opportunities around these job-generating sites, whether it's BAT or Industry City or the Navy Yard, or some of the great things going on in Long Island City, where we should be really focused on building the housing stock so that you create the live-work opportunities, you reduce pressure on mass transit, and you do a lot of affordable housing there, because those tend to be jobs that are accessible to people with a wide range of educational experience. And if you're walking to work, you're much more likely to stay in that job for more than 6 months. So for those landlords, and we try to do this in the Navy Yard, and we're trying to do it at Industry City, by having aggressive local job placement programs, it's not only the right thing, it's not only smart politics, it is smart business, because for these small companies that have 3 to 5 people, they don't have an HR person, so they don't know how to go find their employees. And if that employee has to travel 45 minutes to the job every day, it's unlikely they're going to stay in the job more than 6 months.
Well, and incidentally, I don't think it's an either-or decision. I mean, if we as a city want to succeed, we have to be producing jobs across the spectrum. I was making the point with industry because I think that's the most threatened part of our economy.
Right.
But I think that Andrew and Kyle are exactly right, that we also need to figure out how to harness the growth that's happening without a whole lot of government interference in the creative sectors. That's where the dynamism in the economy is. That's where the real opportunity for growing the wealth and employment opportunities in the city lie. And I think that a lot of the work that everyone up here is doing, whether it's at Industry City or in the Gowanus or in the Watchtower or with RXR in Long Island City and at 470 Vanderbilt, all of that work is an important part of it, but I also think we can't lose sight of the fact that it's not just about repurposing old buildings. We also have to figure out how we can develop new buildings, because no matter how much retrofitting you do of older buildings, they're still old buildings, and they still have some of the challenges of older buildings. And not every business in every sector of the economy is going to be able to shoehorn themselves into old floor plates, old infrastructure, et cetera. And again, this is a challenge that we face as a city, and I know the administration is thinking a lot about this, but how is it that we can make it so that it's economically viable for developers to find land in places that are accessible to transit, where new purpose-built buildings can be constructed that are geared towards helping this sector of the economy to grow.
Well, the trouble is once you upzone these parcels, right, the land just becomes more expensive and it almost neutralizes your ability to create an
Well,
affordable.
especially if you're allowing a mix of uses, because land tends to rise to the value of the highest and best use, which is almost always residential in New York.
There's been some ideas floated around that what we should do is just upzone a lot of the manufacturing sites. There's plenty of M1 zoning, which only allows 1 or 2 floor buildings, and people say, well, this is a perfect area where we should be able to have a 4-story or a 5-story building, and we'd be able to accommodate a lot more commercial tenants. Kyle, is that something that you're considering?
We're certainly working with Carl, Tara Weisbrod, to think about how to update the zoning code. I'm not sure the answer is just upzoning. In fact, I'm sure it's not. It's being a lot more intentional about what the zoning looks like in certain areas, specifically areas that we're concerned about what's going on in industrial. And so having a very intentional zoning code that is tailored to what we want to see in these areas is the answer, so not just an upzoning.
There's a tremendous amount of desire, you can tell just from what you guys are saying and what you hear from tenants, to work, to have their facilities where people live. Rob, is that what you're counting on when SL Green buys a site in Gowanus? Is that what you're going to cater to tenants who want to, have their employees right next door in Park Slope? Is that what the new model is?
For sure, if there's an office development. I mean, I think the future of the Gowanus is not yet written.
Right. You're opening up the possibility it's not definitely what you're going to build is not definitely
For sure.
an office. Okay.
Sure. But I also want to add that I think that transit-oriented development is extremely critical from a work-life balance. I think that with the city's investment in East Side access and improvements to the 4, 5, 6, and a development like One Vanderbilt, that's specifically putting capital into increasing the ability for people to commute to New York City is also critical, because the less time spent commuting is as important as live work.
Did you want to add anything to that, Dan? I wanted to just hear from you about the live-work concept. Clearly, you're in Dumbo, so that's a very hot residential neighborhood.
Sure. I mean, part of the analysis even many of the developers were looking at when they were bidding on the Watchtower campus was the ability to even upzone. That was really what really prompted the sale of the properties. Ultimately, when we bought it, we looked at the demand within Brooklyn and decided that the best use for us was to continue with office and create or convert it from manufacturing to office and meet the demand of the tenants within Brooklyn and the Midtown South market. I think a lot of what tenants are doing is several things. One, evaluating the commute time for their employee base overall, and figuring out if we're going to move here, what does that do to the commute time for each of our employee base? It just so happens a lot of the tech community is based in Brooklyn, so it makes a lot of sense being the first stop in Brooklyn, the F and the AC and 2-3. So it makes a lot of sense for a lot of these creative companies to be there. But that's one of the first things they look at when considering a location to relocate to.
Seth, I wanted to just ask you quickly, the mayor has obviously laid out that he wants to upzone and create affordable housing in 15 areas of the city. He doesn't want to name where, because of course if he names where, the land prices are going to go flying up. Do you think those areas should definitely be, not just in poorer communities or, areas where, where people would say we need it, but also where people work? Do you think that should be part of it, and do you think that is enough of the conversation right now, that we create the housing where people are working, they can go right down the street and work?
Well, I would say it should be accessible to jobs. And that can mean near employment, or that can mean near transportation that gets you to employment. But I think that, again, if you start to have the conversation in an either-or fashion, you've already lost the battle. We're growing by hundreds of thousands of people a year. Our employment base is growing to record levels. We need to create new inventory, incrementally new inventory across the whole range of uses. And as I said, we also need to make sure that we have the services to support all of that. And it's a really tough nut to crack. Cities around the world are struggling with this. I think that the good news is that we have an administration that recognizes, A, that there's a challenge, and B, is committed to seeking to address it. And I think that they also recognize that an important part of the solution is increasing density generally, and I applaud them for that.
Yeah, I think the basic tone in the government right now that the public should share in densification, I think is a great founding place to start. And whether that's through transit-oriented development with FAR increases that are achieved through direct spending on transit or through the provision of affordable housing is a great platform to start from.
Absolutely. If that clock is right, we're out of time. But I could keep on talking to you guys all night. You know, Rob, one thing I did want to ask you, I'm not sure how you guys feel about that.
Let's do it.
One thing I do want to ask you, before we get off here, if I have another quick second, just Rob, you mentioned One Vanderbilt. That's this new giant tower that SL Green is in talks to build right next to Grand Central. You're not getting any tax breaks for that. You're actually having to pay money to build that. You're going to have to pay $200 million to build transit infrastructure there to help the city and the MTA afford that. I just wanted to ask you, you're going to have to charge some pretty lofty rents to make a tower like that pay off. When you see conversations from tenants like JP Morgan saying, well, we need tax breaks, we need all sorts of help to make this work out for us, do you feel confident you can find the users who can pay the freight for that kind of a tower?
There's a lot of different questions in there, so I'll try and attack each of them. But certainly, One Vanderbilt is an unsubsidized project, and I think it goes well beyond that in that we are, as a private developer, making the single largest public infrastructure investment, I think, in the history of New York at $210 million. I think that the spread between what we need to achieve versus subsidized development in Hudson Yards is substantial. It's on the order of magnitude of $50 per square foot in gross office rents, which is unprecedented. And we think that it's still achievable, though, because the high end of the New York market continues to improve. The number of $100 per square foot office leases signed so far year to date is at a level that is record-breaking, if not the highest level. So from our perspective, we think that transit-oriented development in this site will achieve those rents because of what it offers to its tenants in terms of commute time savings.
Thank you, guys. I really want to thank you for a great panel today, and thank you for joining us.